On a humid June night in Mississippi, a chapter closed on one of the most controversial, long-running death row cases in American history. Richard Gerald Jordan, an old man whose life had become a legal footnote, finally met his fate after outlasting nearly every other inmate on the row. But Jordan's story isn't simply about a crime and a punishment. It's a window into the flaws, delays, and moral ambiguities of the U.S. justice system. Would you survive nearly half a century under the shadow of death, knowing every legal twist might mean your last sunrise? In this video, we peel back the layers behind Jordan's crime, the extraordinary legal marathon that followed, and his final hours in the execution chamber. Watch closely, because what happened in Mississippi wasn't just a personal reckoning. It's a case that still haunts the system. Richard Gerald Jordan's story begins in the Deep South, in the heart of Mississippi during the late 1940s. He was born into a world in flux, a post-war landscape where families clung tightly to tradition and hope. Petal, Mississippi, was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and reputations were hard to shake, good or bad. Jordan's childhood seemed, by most accounts, unremarkable. He attended local schools, made friends, and followed the familiar path to high school graduation, blending in with the generations who'd come before him. But the world outside Mississippi was changing, and like many of his era, Richard looked for meaning and escape in military service. He joined the Army and was swept off to Vietnam, a crucible that shaped and scarred countless young Americans. Those who knew him said the war changed Richard. He returned quieter, more withdrawn, and restless. Back home, he married and started a family, seeking the solace of stability. He took a job managing a fertilizer plant in Louisiana, and for a few years, life appeared steady. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Economic hardship in the 1970s hit working families hard, and the Jordans were no exception. By his early 30s, Richard was underwater financially. The debts kept coming: car payments, boat loans, and the inescapable tide of consumer credit that so many Americans faced. The pressure weighed on him, and with each missed payment, the line between right and wrong blurred just a little more. Desperation drives ordinary people to extraordinary acts. In January 1976, the strain proved too much for Richard. He devised a plan that would forever alter the course of his life and destroy another. Richard set his sights on Gulfport, a coastal Mississippi city where wealthy families lived behind manicured lawns and tall fences. He chose his target almost at random, focusing on the Martyr family after learning of their financial standing through local rumor and a chance conversation. Armed with a .38 caliber pistol, which he'd obtained by trading in his old shotgun at a Baton Rouge pawn shop, Richard put his plan in motion. He lied to his own parents, inventing a story about a physical for a job on an offshore oil rig. But his true destination was the Martyr home. On January 12th, Richard arrived at their door, posing as a utility worker sent to check the circuit breakers. Inside, Edwina Martyr, a 34-year-old mother, greeted him without suspicion, her young son sleeping nearby. What followed was a moment of calculated cruelty. Richard forced Edwina into her own car at gunpoint, leaving her toddler behind. He drove her miles away, deeper and deeper into the isolation of DeSoto National Forest. There, in the dense woods, his plan unraveled. Richard later claimed he only wanted ransom and never intended to harm Edwina. But as she tried to run, he pulled the trigger. Ballistics experts later testified that the shot was fired as she knelt on the ground, motionless, contradicting Richard's account. With Edwina dead, Richard made a chilling choice. Rather than panic or flee, he calmly bought a movie ticket and watched Death Wish, a film about revenge and violence. The contrast was as cold as it was haunting. Outside, Edwina's body lay in the shadows of the forest, while her family remained ignorant of her fate, clinging to hope. Richard's next move was as calculated as his first. He phoned Chuck Martyr, Edwina's husband, pretending she was still alive and demanding a $50,000 ransom for her safe return. The voice on the line was steady, almost businesslike. Chuck, devastated but desperate to save his wife, agreed to the terms. But the police were already involved, and a plan was quickly set in motion to catch the kidnapper. The first attempted ransom drop was a tense standoff. Officers tailed Chuck to the meeting point, hiding in hopes of catching Richard in the act. But Richard was no fool. He noticed the police presence immediately and called off the exchange, furious at what he saw as a betrayal. He called Chuck again, this time lowering the ransom to $25,000 and issuing new, complex instructions. The second drop site was chosen to avoid surveillance, requiring Chuck to make a dizzying series of turns and detours. On January 13th, at the new location along Interstate 10, FBI agents and sheriff's deputies lay in wait. As Richard approached, the trap was sprung. He slammed his car into the waiting police vehicle and sped away, shots ringing out behind him. For a brief moment, he managed to slip through the net, abandoning his car and trying to disappear into the city. But his luck was short-lived. Later that afternoon, police found him in a taxicab, arrested him, and recovered much of the ransom money. Back at the station, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Richard confessed to the crime and led officers to Edwina's body and the murder weapon. The Martyr family's worst fears were confirmed, and the community of Gulfport was left reeling from the senseless tragedy. The magnitude of the crime gripped Mississippi. By July 1976, the case was front-page news across the state. The intensity of media coverage forced a change of venue from Harrison County to neighboring Jackson County in hopes of seating an impartial jury. The prosecution called 24 witnesses, piecing together a narrative of premeditation, deception, and deadly violence. The defense presented no witnesses. Not even Richard himself took the stand. It took the jury only 4 hours to reach their verdict: guilty of capital murder. At the time, Mississippi law mandated the death penalty for such crimes. The sentence was swift and, at least initially, final. But the American justice system was in flux. That same year, the U.S. Supreme Court declared mandatory death sentences unconstitutional. For Richard, the legal saga was only beginning. A second trial in 1977 brought new procedures, dividing the proceedings into separate guilt and penalty phases. The outcome, however, was identical. Again, Richard was found guilty and again sentenced to death, despite defense efforts to humanize him in the eyes of the jury. His attorney argued that Richard had been a good man until some unnamed trauma broke him, but the jury was unmoved. The next decade was a carousel of appeals and court decisions. In the early 1980s, Richard's defense challenged his sentence, claiming jurors hadn't received proper guidance about aggravating circumstances, a technicality, but one with enormous implications. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed, vacating the sentence and ordering a new hearing. A third death sentence followed in 1983, but this too was overturned when it was revealed Richard wasn't allowed to present evidence of his rehabilitation in prison. Even the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in, forcing Mississippi courts to start over yet again. By the late 1980s, prosecutors were exhausted by the relentless cycle of trials, appeals, and reversals. In 1991, they offered Richard a deal: plead guilty in exchange for life without parole and agree to stop filing appeals. Richard accepted, hoping for a measure of finality, but the law had one more twist in store. At the time of Richard's plea deal, Mississippi law did not allow life without parole for first-time capital defendants. Only death or life with parole were available. When Richard discovered this loophole, he challenged his sentence in court, hoping to be resentenced to life with the chance of parole. Instead, the courts vacated the plea agreement entirely, sending him back for a fourth sentencing hearing. The 1998 hearing was a final reckoning. This time, there would be no deals, no technicalities left unchallenged. The prosecution, led by the same district attorney who had opposed the 1991 plea, pressed for execution. The defense marshaled a dozen witnesses, family, prison staff, and clergy, all attesting to Richard's good behavior, his intelligence, and his attempts at personal reform. Richard had spent his years in prison working on electrical projects, writing stories, and serving as a trustee. But to the jury, the decades since the crime did not outweigh its brutality. After just 35 minutes of deliberation, they handed down a death sentence for the fourth and final time. If Richard thought the end was near, he was mistaken. The new sentence launched another round of appeals, legal filings, and procedural delays that would stretch for another quarter century. Over the years, the execution of death sentences in Mississippi slowed to a crawl. By the 2010s, pharmaceutical companies stopped selling lethal injection drugs to prisons, sparking a nationwide crisis for states that relied on them. Inmates, including Richard, joined lawsuits challenging the safety and legality of alternative drugs. As a result, executions were suspended for years. Throughout his time on death row, Richard's case became a symbol of the American death penalty's contradictions, where the process of execution often outlasted the condemned. Friends and attorneys described him as a man resigned to his fate, but never entirely at peace. In his later years, he became known for writing essays and short stories, trying to make sense of a life defined by a single, catastrophic mistake. His appeals, based on everything from prosecutorial misconduct to evolving standards of decency, were ultimately rejected by both state and federal courts. In 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his final appeal, and the clock began to run out for the last time. On June 25, 2025, after 49 years of waiting, the day arrived. Richard Gerald Jordan, aged 79, was led from his cell to the death chamber at the Mississippi State Penitentiary. As the state's oldest and longest-serving death row inmate, his execution was witnessed by prison officials, journalists, and members of both his own and the martyr families. Tradition granted Richard the right to a last meal of his choosing. He opted for classic Southern comfort food: crispy fried chicken, mashed potatoes loaded with gravy, collard greens, and a generous slice of pecan pie. To drink, he chose sweet iced tea, a nod, perhaps, to the simpler days of his youth. Prison staff noted he ate quietly, barely touching his food, lost in thought. As he was strapped to the gurney, witnesses described Richard as calm and subdued. When asked if he had any final words, he spoke directly to the martyr family. "I am deeply sorry for all the pain I caused. I have carried this burden every day, and I pray you can find some peace." His voice barely above a whisper, he declined to address the public or media. The drugs were administered, and within minutes, Richard Gerald Jordan was pronounced dead. The case of Richard Gerald Jordan stands as a haunting parable of desperation, loss, and the grinding machinery of justice. Nearly 50 years passed from the day of Edwina Martyr's murder to the execution that finally closed the file. Did justice finally prevail, or did the system simply exhaust itself? That's a question every viewer must answer for themselves. If you found this story thought-provoking, share your thoughts in the comments below. What's your verdict on the death penalty, and do cases like this change your mind? Be sure to subscribe to Prime Time Crime for more true stories that challenge the boundaries of law, morality, and fate. Until next time, remember, the past is never really past. It's waiting, just out of sight, for someone to tell its story again.
September 20, 1993, Castleberry, Florida. A quiet home, a sleeping family, and a man about to unleash unspeakable horror. Inside that house, 4 children lay curled up in the living room, their grandmother resting peacefully in her bedroom. It was supposed to be a night like any other, but before dawn, 2 of them would never wake up again. Edward Thomas James had been given a place to stay, a roof, a room, and trust. But sometime after midnight, he crossed a line no one could ever come back from. Fueled by alcohol, drugs, and something even darker, he walked into that living room and made his choice. He reached down, his hands closing around the small, sleeping body of 8-year-old Toni Marie Nunar. She barely had time to scream before the air was stolen from her lungs. With 1 life taken, the horror was far from over. James moved to the next room, where Betty Dick lay unaware of the monster creeping toward her. The first blow struck hard, too hard for her to fight back. Stunned, bleeding, she gasped out in confusion, "Why, Eddie, why?" But there was no answer, only the cold weight of a blade as it found her over and over again. By the time the sun rose, the home was silent, except for the sound of one terrified child escaping into the night. The nightmare was only just beginning. It started with a sandwich, a simple, harmless act. Bread, meat, cheese. Edward Thomas James stood in the dim glow of the kitchen, his hands steady as he built his midnight snack. To anyone watching, he looked like just another man getting a late-night meal. But beneath that calm, behind those dark, unfocused eyes, something twisted was brewing. In the living room, 4 children slept soundly, their small bodies bundled under. 8-year-old Toni Marie Nunar lay closest to the doorway, unaware that the man who had once been like an uncle was about to take everything from her. James stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the room, his hands, strong, rough from years of violence, wrapped around Toni's throat. Her eyes shot open, a moment of confusion, then panic, then pain. She kicked, clawed, her tiny hands grasping at his arms. But he was stronger. The light in her eyes flickered. Then it was gone. James lifted her lifeless body and carried her to his room. What happened next was an act so unspeakable, so depraved it defies reason. By the time he was finished, Toni was no longer a little girl, just another broken thing discarded on the floor, her innocence shattered, her future erased. But James wasn't done. He had to clean up the mess. Betty Dick, the woman who had given him a home, was just down the hall. He picked up a heavy candlestick. The first strike stunned her awake. The second sent blood splattering across the sheets. "Why, Eddie? Why?" she gasped. But James had no answer, only more violence. By the time he was finished, she had been stabbed 23 times. The room reeked of iron and death. And in the doorway stood 9-year-old Wendy, her eyes wide with horror. She had seen everything. The house was no longer a home, it was a crime scene. Blood soaked the sheets, the walls, the carpet. Edward Thomas James stood in the center of it all, his chest rising and falling in deep, unsteady breaths. His hands, once used to steal and fight, had now taken something far worse: life. Betty Dick's lifeless body lay crumpled on the bed, the deep gashes in her flesh still seeping. The candlestick, its weight now unfamiliar in his hand, slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. In the eerie silence, the only sound was the shallow, ragged breathing of 9-year-old Wendy Nunar, his last remaining witness. Her small frame trembled, eyes locked on the horror before her. She had seen everything, the way her grandmother gasped for air, the way Toni Marie's body had been dragged away like a discarded doll, and now she was next. James lunged forward, grabbing Wendy before she could flee. His hands were rough, unyielding as he tied her wrists, forcing her into another room. "Don't hurt my brothers," she whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. James hesitated. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, pure terror mixed with the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe, just maybe, some small, rotting part of his conscience stirred. "I won't," he muttered, but he had already broken every other promise he had ever made. The house reeked of death, but James moved with cold precision. He stripped Betty of her jewelry, rifled through her purse, and found her car keys. His heart pounded, his vision blurred from the cocktail of alcohol, crack cocaine, and adrenaline surging through his veins. He had to run, had to get away before the walls closed in on him. As he sped away in Betty's stolen car, Wendy fought against the knots binding her wrists. The moment she was free, she ran, barefoot, breathless, into the night, toward her uncle's house. Her tiny fists pounded on the door, her voice hoarse from screaming. "He killed them," she sobbed. "He killed them all." By the time police arrived, the nightmare inside was undeniable. 2 bodies, a child brutalized beyond recognition, and one monster now on the run. The night air carried Wendy Nunar's sobs as officers wrapped a blanket around her trembling shoulders. She was the only survivor, the only voice left to tell the world what had happened inside that house of horrors. But the man who had caused it all, Edward Thomas James, had vanished into the darkness. A statewide manhunt began before dawn. His face flooded every news channel, every newspaper, every bulletin board from Florida to Georgia. But James was no stranger to running. He had spent years evading the law, slipping in and out of arrests like a shadow. Now, with blood on his hands and stolen jewelry in his pockets, he was more desperate than ever. Days turned into a week. Leads poured in, some false, some terrifyingly real. A pawnshop owner in Indiana reported a man trading in gold rings and bracelets. A store clerk in Colorado recalled a nervous drifter, barely making eye contact as he paid for a can of beer. And then, a call that changed everything. A woman named Priscilla Valdez was sitting inside a Bakersfield, California employment office when she froze. Just one night earlier, she had seen his face plastered across her TV screen on America's Most Wanted. Now that same man sat just feet away from her, filling out a job application as if he hadn't just slaughtered 2 people. Her pulse raced. She whispered to an employee, "I need to use the phone. That man behind me." "He's Edward James." The employee's eyes widened, but they nodded. Within minutes, officers swarmed the building. James barely had time to react before he was surrounded, his escape cut off. He raised his hands, his voice low, resigned. "I knew you'd find me." The nightmare was over. The killer was in custody. But for Wendy Nunar, for the grieving family, and for the town that would never forget, the scars would never heal. Inside the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, Edward Thomas James sat slumped in a metal chair, his wrists shackled to the table. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the chill in the air. Across from him, detectives stared, waiting. They had him. They knew it. But they needed to hear him say it. For hours, James refused to speak, his fingers twitching against the steel cuffs, his eyes darting toward the two-way mirror. Then, as if surrendering to the weight of his own guilt, he sighed. "For what I did, there's nothing I can say to make it right. Just put me down already." And then, the floodgates opened. James confessed to everything. The drugs, the drinking, the uncontrollable rage that burned inside him when he walked into that living room and saw little Tony Marie asleep. His voice was eerily calm as he described how he pressed his hands around her throat, how she clawed at his arms before going limp. "I don't know why I picked her," he muttered, eyes vacant. "I just did." Detectives clenched their jaws as he continued, detailing how he beat Betty Dick with a candlestick, how she pleaded with him between blows. "Why, Eddie? Why?" He mimicked her voice, then let out a humorless chuckle. "That's what she kept saying?" The room was silent. Even the seasoned detectives, men who had spent their careers hunting monsters, looked disturbed. One of them pushed back his chair and left the room, unable to listen any longer. The trial was swift. The jury needed no convincing. The evidence was overwhelming, the horror undeniable. 2 years after the murders, Edward James stood in an orange jumpsuit, hands bound, as the judge delivered his fate, sentenced to death. But even as he was led away in chains, one question remained. Was justice truly served? Would execution bring peace to the victims' families? Or was it simply another act of violence in an already blood-stained story? On the night of his execution, Edward Thomas James sat alone in his cell. The walls were bare. The only sound was the ticking of the clock mounted just outside the heavy steel bars. Time was running out. He had requested a final meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a slice of cherry pie. But when the tray was slid through the slot, he barely touched it. Instead, he sat in silence, staring at the concrete floor, the weight of his fate pressing down like an iron grip around his throat. When the guards arrived, he didn't fight. Shackles clanked as they locked around his wrists and ankles. The walk to the execution chamber was short, but with each step the room seemed to close in tighter around him. The lights were blinding, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and metal. Beyond the glass partition, witnesses gathered, Gerald, state officials, and members of the victims' families, waiting for justice to be served. As he was strapped to the gurney, James turned his head toward the viewing window. His lips parted as if to say something, but the words never came. The executioner's voice echoed through the chamber. Final words? Silence. The warden gave the signal. A deep breath, the sharp sting of the needle, a slow exhale. Within minutes his eyes fluttered shut. The chest that had once heaved with violent rage now rose and fell one final time. Edward James was pronounced dead at 11:46 p.m. But as the curtain fell, one lingering question remained. Did justice die with him? Or did the ghosts of his victims still whisper in the walls of that prison? Like, comment, and subscribe for more true crime stories. Hit the bell so you never miss an update.
Edward Thomas James. The case of Edward Thomas James is one that left even the most hardened detectives shaken. A crime that began on a warm Florida afternoon and ended with 2 lives lost and a family destroyed. It was March 2010 in Jacksonville when neighbors first noticed something was wrong at the small single-story home on Willow Avenue. The silence was unusual, the lights left burning late into the night. When a relative stopped by to check in, what they found inside would haunt them for years to come. Lying just steps apart in the living room were the bodies of 2 women, both white, both family members. The scene was a blur of chaos, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and the stillness that comes only after violence has run its course. Investigators quickly pieced together the events. Edward James, recently released from prison and staying with relatives as he tried to rebuild his life, had arrived unannounced. What began as a tense argument over money and trust escalated with terrifying speed. Witnesses would later recall hearing raised voices and the crash of broken dishes. What followed was swift and brutal. James attacked both women with a blunt object, then used a kitchen knife, leaving no chance for escape or defense. When the police arrived, James was nowhere to be found, but the evidence was overwhelming. Blood matched his clothes, his fingerprints covered the room. He was arrested within 24 hours, trying to hitch a ride out of town. At trial, the prosecution focused on the savagery of the attack, painting James as a man driven by anger and resentment. The defense, in turn, offered a fractured portrait of a life marred by addiction, poverty, and untreated mental illness. But the jury needed only 2 hours to decide. James was found guilty of the murders of 2 white female family members. The judge delivered the sentence: death by lethal injection. On March 20th, 2025, after nearly 15 years of appeals, Edward James faced his final hour. The state kept his last meal private. When asked for final words, he simply stared ahead, silent. At 6:17 p.m., the drugs were administered. By the time the doctor pronounced him dead, The house on Willow Avenue had long since been emptied, but the memory of what happened there would never be erased. These are the names and stories that filled America's execution chambers in the first months of 2025. Lives ended, families forever changed, and wounds that time alone can't heal. Behind each sentence was a crime, behind every last meal a moment of reflection, and in every final word, a search for meaning that sometimes never comes. As the calendar turns, the questions linger: justice or closure, punishment or pain. The next chapter, as always, is never far behind.